Welcome to The Explainer. You know, sometimes in the legal world, a case that seems to be about one thing is actually about something else entirely. Today, we're diving into a story that stretched over 15 years. It's about a veteran's fight for benefits, sure, but it was completely derailed by a single piece of paper, and it reveals this powerful, almost frustrating truth about our legal system. Sometimes, the process is the verdict.
All right, so here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll start with the veteran's claim and its long history. Then we're going to zero in on the one form that was misread. This is the real turning point. We'll get into the legal fight over something called a harmless error, see what the Federal Circuit finally had to say, and then wrap it all up with the big lesson here. Why in law, procedure is absolutely everything.
So, this all starts with Robert M. Laird, a Marine Corps veteran. And this is his story, a long, long fight to get the service-connected disability benefits that he believed he was entitled to. Now, just look at this timeline for a second. What jumps out at you is the incredible length of this thing. It kicks off in 2010, a year later he gets a rating, but then look at that gap between his 2012 filing and the board's decision in 2022. That is a full decade. The whole journey, from start to finish, took more than 15 years. Which just goes to show you how slow and complex these systems can be.
Okay, so now let's get to the absolute heart of this case, this entire decade-plus legal battle. It really all hinges on one single document that Mr. Laird filed way back in 2012. And this is the question we really need to unpack. How on earth could one piece of paper, filed by a veteran who is representing himself, completely derail a case that would go on for more than a decade? It seems unbelievable, right?
Well, this slide right here shows you the whole problem in a nutshell. On the left, that's what Mr. Laird meant to do, file something called a Notice of Disagreement, which is basically an appeal of a decision. But on the right, that's how the board treated it, as a brand new claim for a higher rating. And that one single misinterpretation, well, it changed everything.
You see, this mistake created this devastating domino effect. Because the board saw it as a new claim, it triggered a very specific rule, a one-year look-back rule for evidence. What that means is the board would only look at evidence from the past 12 months. So just like that, years of Mr. Laird's medical history were effectively walled off, and they couldn't even be reviewed.
So the case then moves up the ladder to the Court of Appeals for Veterans Claims. And here, the whole debate shifted. The question wasn't really if a mistake was made anymore, it was whether that mistake actually mattered in the grand scheme of things.
And what the Veterans Court said was fascinating. They were totally clear. They said, yep, the board messed up, they misread the form, but, and this is a huge but, they also decided that this mistake didn't actually change the final outcome for Mr. Laird. They called it a harmless error.
Okay, but that raises a really critical question, doesn't it? If a mistake means that key pieces of evidence get ignored, how can you possibly call that error harmless? What was the real-world impact here?
And here's the answer. Mr. Laird's legal team argued that this error was anything but harmless. It meant he never got a full and fair review of his entire record. Specifically, because of that one-year look-back rule, a super important PTSD exam from June 2011, which was just a few months outside that window, was never even looked at by the board.
So this brings us to the final stop on the legal train, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit. And this is where the case didn't just hit a roadblock, it ran smack into a giant procedural brick wall.
Okay, before we go any further, we need a quick sidebar on a really important legal concept, jurisdiction. The simplest way to think about it is like a court's official job description. It very strictly defines what a court is allowed to rule on and what it's not. And the Federal Circuit has a very specific and limited jurisdiction in these kinds of cases. It can answer what are called questions of law, like what does the statute actually mean? But what it absolutely cannot do is rule on the application of law to facts. That means it can't go back and reweigh all the evidence or second-guess how a lower court applied a rule to a particular set of facts. That distinction is everything here.
And here's the knockout punch. Mr. Laird's entire appeal was built on arguing that the harmless error ruling was wrong. But the Federal Circuit said, hold on. Deciding whether an error was harmless or not is an application of law to fact, the very thing we are legally forbidden to review. And with that, the courthouse doors were essentially slammed shut.
And if that wasn't enough, the court pointed to a second procedural barrier, something called the waiver doctrine. The biggest argument, the one about that excluded PTSD exam, well, it was raised too late in the game. In the legal world, it's kind of like use it or lose it. If you don't make your argument at the right time, you waive your right to make it later on.
So for two purely procedural reasons, a lack of jurisdiction and the waiver doctrine, the Federal Circuit just dismissed the appeal. The court never ever got to decide on the actual merits of Mr. Laird's claim. The process itself became the final verdict.
So after all that, after a 15-year legal odyssey that ends not with a bang, but with a quiet procedural dismissal, what are we supposed to take away from this? What's the big lesson here?
Well, this case is a really sobering lesson for anybody trying to navigate a complex legal or government system. It shows that procedure isn't just annoying red tape. It can literally be the whole ballgame. You have to raise your arguments at the right time, you have to understand what each court can and can't do, and you have to realize that a tiny little mistake like using the wrong form can have absolutely catastrophic consequences down the road.
And that leaves us with this big final thought. A case like Mr. Laird's really highlights this constant tension that exists in our legal system. The tension between the need for strict, predictable rules and the ultimate goal of getting a fair, just outcome for the actual people involved. It's a balance the system grapples with every single day.
This is for entertainment and educational purposes only. This is not legal advice.